Hello and welcome to Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. We're celebrating a big milestone today at the Dolby Institute podcast because this is episode number 100 of our show. I never dreamed when I sat down a few years ago to talk with Randy Tom on episode number 1 about his career and his approach to sound design and his philosophy on making sound for movies that we would still be going strong 100 episodes later, but here we are. And I think we've got a special episode for you today. You're going to enjoy this. We have director Edgar Wright, who is returning to the show for his second visit. He was on episode number 24, if you remember, talking with his longtime sound design and re-recording mixer collaborator, Julian Slater. And today they're back again with the addition of their composer, Stephen Price, to talk about their latest film, the thriller Last Night in Soho. This is a really fun movie, and we had a great conversation about it. And it actually kind of points to a theme that I think has been emerging lately and a trend that I'm really happy to see, which is filmmakers thinking more kind of cohesively about the role of sound design and music together and working with those artists in conjunction to have a really cohesive approach to the track, which Last Night in Soho certainly does. Like many of Edgar Wright's films, this movie plays around a lot with genre and a tone, and it has a really rich soundtrack, seamlessly melding sound design, score, and classic hit songs as he transports us back to another era, the seedy underbelly of 1960s London. So much like in our discussion with Denis Villeneuve and his team on Dune, Edgar brought his sound team on very early in the process, almost as if he were crafting many elements of the soundtrack even before the camera started rolling. So this is a fascinating glimpse into the creative process behind these three artists and how they were able to pull the amazing track for this film together. So I hope you enjoy this film and this conversation, so let's dive in and hear what they have to say. I always like to start with the filmmaker just asking, what was it about this particular story, Last Night in Soho, that kind of grabbed you, that made you feel like this is the story that I need to tell at this point in time? And how did the project start for you?
I guess it's like a combination of things. I feel some movies, and Baby Driver is similar, and Last Night in Soho as well, that they're just gestating in my head for such a long time that at a certain point I have to it's like the film is haunting me, and I have to exercise it by making the movie. Otherwise, I'll never stop thinking about it. And so, I guess like with this movie, there's two sort of big inspirations. One would be the decade of the '60s, which I guess my obsession with that started through music, through my parents' record collection. When I was growing up, they used to have quite a slim box of '60s records that it seemed to stop dead when my older brother was born. There didn't seem to be any 70s albums. It was just like 60s albums, this one box. And I never heard them listening to them. So I would like steal the box, and then I would just listen to these albums over and over and over again. And in a pre-internet, even like pre-TV in my room sort of era of just like listening to these albums and watching the vinyl go round and reading the small print on the albums over and over again. I just, that's what started my obsession with the decade. And then moving to London 27 years ago and spending an enormous amount of time in Soho was the other inspiration, because the shadow of the 60s looms really large over Soho, both the good and the bad. Like there was a point in the mid-60s where like London was like a world leader and the epicenter of cool in fashion and music and art and film. But also around that time as well, Soho was also well known as well as being the heart of show business, it was also a den of iniquity in terms of, the criminal underworld and the sex industry. And it was a strange kind of, that's just, not even strange bedfellows, that weird thing where the two things seem to go together, where the high and the low coexisted. And it was like that when I moved to London in the 90s, and it's sort of slowly gone away, but not quite. So it's an area that we all work all the time, because all of the, the kind of the post-production houses in London, lots of them are based in Soho. And it's still like a very sort of compelling and sometimes disturbing area because even as it gets gentrified and stuff, like after midnight, the old Soho starts to kind of rise up. So, and this is a place where like the three of us work a lot, and many times have walked out of Delane Lee on Dean Street into sometimes kind of some quite kind of intense kind of energy in the air in Soho. So it's an area that's like very has kind of influenced artists and writers for like 400 years, and this film is no exception.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? I know you co-wrote this film, but as you're writing and as you're working on the script, what are you thinking about in terms of sound design and music as you're actually writing? Is that something that is is part of your consciousness as you're formulating the script?
Well, the great thing about working with like Steve and Julian, and also my editor Paul Machliss, is that we work together so much that it's great to be able to think about those elements when you're writing, and also to be able to talk to everybody about it before we've shot a frame in the movie. So that's an unusual thing to do with like sort of a composer, and an even more unusual thing probably to do with Julian, to talk, you know, to the sort of sound designer and like about a film where you haven't shot a frame of it yet. But as with Baby Driver and with this, it's something where I include everybody very early on. And in this case, Steve wrote some of the score just based on the script. And in fact, that music, like obviously there's much more to it than that, but parts of that music sort of are in the finished film. So that to me is is a great collaboration where Steve could get inspired by just what's on the page and come up with something that's exactly, right for the movie before you actually started filming. Some of the cues that Steve did as demos, I used to play in the auditions. I was doing some auditions for sort of scary sequences, and I'd actually play what would eventually become some of the score of the music, let alone then what you can do on set when you can play the music that's happening, or do sort of certain mixes of like existing songs, or use the score on the set. And I'm pretty sure, Julian, I'm sure that we had conversations with it before I started shooting as well. That'd be correct, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It's kind of how it goes with Edgar. He as he says, he's got, as I leave one movie, he's talking about 3 or 4 possibilities for his next ones, and sound is always kind of entwined in there, and conversations start even at that point, even as we're finishing the current movie, and Edgar's already thinking about the next one. So I think I've said it before. It's when there's a collaboration that runs as deep as ours does, including Paul as well, Machliss, it just makes for a great breeding ground of ideas. And unlike pretty much all the other composers I work with, Steve is just a good friend. We swap texts 2 or 3 times a week anyway from over the pond. And it just means that, there's a great sharing of ideas as the process is going through. There's, we're swapping ideas, and Steve is sending me what he's thinking of, and we're sending him what we're thinking of. And it just breeds a good creative juice, I'd say. It just means that there's no restrictions on ideas.
Part of what I love about what you're talking about is that, all too often there's a bit of a tug of war between the sound design and the music once you get to the final mixing stage, and everybody feels like they're 100% responsible for the success or failure of the movie. So it's great to hear that you guys are talking about, the joint creative approach. And Edgar, I presume you're making some decisions about what element is going to step forward at any given moment and kind of drive the sonic experience for the film.
I don't know if that's true, actually, because I think we all work together. I think what's been really great about collaborating for so long is that there isn't that competition. I think probably if you work on movies where departments are working independently from each other, then it becomes more of a scrabble in the final mix for everybody to be heard. But that hasn't really been the case with the way that we work, because we all work so closely together, even with a first cut. And there'd be things where myself and Paul Machliss, the editor, would be throwing things to Steve and Julian, saying like, hey, we need something for this and we need something for that, where I guess in a way, like to me, it's also about sort of transparency, is that there's some sort of directors who, like, their method is not to tell the rest of the crew anything. And that they become the dark and mysterious genius by doing that. But I like to sort of lay all my cards on the table and sort of say to the crew, I will give you as much to read, watch, or listen to as much as you can take. And so you're kind of like saying, if you want to be completely in the headspace of how I came up with this movie, I'm happy to tell you. Because to me, like, being a director, like the thing that you're essentially trying to do with the cast and the crew is make sure that everybody is making the same movie. And the more that you can kind of communicate what the movie is, the better results you'll get. And then the great thing is like, having worked with Steve and Julian for years now, we all know what we can do, and we're all looking to sort of push each other. And what can we do to kind of like keep sort of breaking new ground or try something new or experiment? And so there's no like wrong answer to anything. It's just like a great creative process. So I mean, and I'm speaking for you guys, but I don't feel like we get as precious about each other's. I can see how that could happen on another movie if you've got like a composer and like a sound team working separately from each other. That then in the final mix, it's kind of like a fight to see who comes out on top. But I don't ever feel like that on any of our films. I feel like we've been working in tandem since the infancy of the project.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the infancy of the project, and for the last how many years? Quite a few years, I think. And I think it's great
on this one, like three or 4 years, probably since Baby Driver, in fact.
Great example of that is like the sequence where Ellie's running through Soho with Always Something to Remind Me. That's like that was a sequence that was a lot of prep work was done way before the mix in the Avid and with Steve and the sound team. And Steve is kind of throwing the kitchen sink at that sequence, as are we, but it's all done in a very kind of, we could have, spent 2 weeks mixing that one sequence, and it could have turned into a complete kind of audio mess. But I think because we all knew that had A, great possibilities as a sequence, and B, it could easily kind of unravel itself and be a bit of a sonic muddle. We all did our part in making sure that when we got to the mix, all the parts were there in the right order. So it was a question of mixing it and not trying to make it sound as good as possible, and not spend time trying to make it stop making it sound bad. You know what I mean? Those are the kind of things that constant communication with Steve and Edgar pay off in the prep, I would say.
I want to ask you about that sequence, Stephen. One of the things that I think is discussed about Edgar's work is that there's a lot of source cues existing, music from the era that Edgar uses quite creatively to set mood and tone. So, what's your relationship with the source cues, and are they kind of handled in a completely separate sort of work track from the score? Are you working them into score? Like, what's your relationship with it? And maybe that's the sequence that Julian mentioned is a good one to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the sequences where we've pushed some of the techniques we've been developing for several films as far as we've ever pushed them, further than we've pushed them. And for me, we have these amazing resources, these source songs that are there, but we never kind of just use them purely as that. They're always, how can these help the stories? How can we actually look at them in a slightly different way? And sometimes that means me joining a source track with score and starting to change the meaning of the song as we go. And sometimes, as in the Sandy Shore track, we really sort of took that song apart, and it kind of morphs into this nightmare vision, sort of Revolution number 9 type take on the thing, which really plays into the story, as our lead character's kind of experience is kind of melting all around us, so does the track. So for me, the source tracks are kind of an opportunity to give those songs another meaning as well, and everything is always kind of explored as far as we can do with all of these things. There's not a single track that's just planted in there without something else going on. We might be tuning an element of the sound design to go with that track, so it all feels like this constant experience. And again, it's all about being able to speak directly to Julian and his team, and how can we help with this? How can you help us with that? And gradually these sequences come together. Paul and Edgar kind of guide us all the way through the process. And, they will do things that then suggest more ideas to us. So the whole thing becomes this great big cycle of, being inspired by what the other persons are doing.
So, Stephen, your background is as a music editor, which is pretty unusual for a composer. But as the process that you were just describing, I wonder if that's influenced by your background in music editing, if you approach it differently as a composer because of that background.
I think it definitely gives me a sense that the entire soundtrack's important, and I'm not just here to do the score and that's my bit and everything else I don't care about. To me, this whole thing, we've got to make the whole film swim. We've got to make it feel like the whole thing is just rolling along and feeling so intended. And the source tracks are part of that. And everything is given its due. And that's some of that definitely comes from the fact I started with Edgar back on Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I was the music editor on that film. And some of these ideas we were playing with back then, and it's just developed. But now I get to join along with score, and then, the score has its own life launching from all these tracks. So it's an ever evolving job. So, yeah.
A mere 10 years ago, Steve.
Well, I think we started talking about Baby Driver in 2007, Edgar and I. So it's been a good chunk of time now.
Yeah. No, that's how we first met, in fact. It was before Scott Pilgrim. It was like I was trying to write Baby Driver that far back, and I wanted to help of somebody to break down the songs that I wanted to use. Because I don't read music or anything, and I don't play any instruments. So I wanted to sort of break down the songs I wanted to use into musical terminology. And I think it was like our line producer at the time, Ronaldo Vasconcelos, who recommended you. And so that's when we met, was to sort of do that, which was before Scott Pilgrim versus the World. And in fact, 10 years before Baby Driver came out as well.
Exactly. It's been something that we've constantly sort of tweaked. And a project like this, when I was sending in demos, I couldn't do that with many productions, have the confidence to send in these pretty rough ideas and know that, they were going to be listened to and maybe played with, and ideas will come back. And, I gave stems to Paul Machliss, and he was happy for him to cut them into the cut. So when I first started seeing things, it had bits of my music there, which would then suggest other things that I could go and do. So it's just a nice open process that we've developed over the years.
I was just going to say, Steve's actually quite a fast composer. So, and I don't know, because I think Steve has been in the trenches and understands the time constraints that we are all under on a day-to-day basis. I've seen, Edgar watch a sequence, give notes, and then, Steve sending it back that afternoon, which is great because it just means that there's an immediacy that's going on as well, which is quite rare.
I think that whole back and forth thing has benefited at all, really. The fact that we're all kind of very much on it and very much keen to see how far we can take each sequence. So, I'm often sending back things to Julian, Edgar, Dan Morgan, our dialogue editor. I stepped on his toes a lot on this film. There's lots of dialogue in the music tracks that's looping around and causing echoes, but he's very keen to do that and to see where we can take that. So it's been a good one to play with.
There's one actor, he only has 2 lines in the movie, but one of his lines gets repeated in the score quite a lot. He says, so she can sing, and it gets repeated as a sample. And I saw him the other day in front of the cast and crew screening, and I said, "Hey, Terence," I said, listen out in the soundtrack. You get quite a lot of airplay in the movie because his line gets repeated over and over again. And that's something I really like that aspect. It's interesting. It's interesting to mention Revolution Number 9, which to this day is still like a terrifying song and my least favorite Beatles song. But in the context of this film, like we'd use it as a thing, say, hey, let's do the Revolution Number 9 version of this kind of like sequence of this repeated dialogue. And that was something, that's something that's like you said, it's unusual to take elements where you're sort of essentially sampling the movie and taking like dialogue and bringing like elements from what Julian and Dan are doing into the score and vice versa. I think that can only come, if we were doing this and it was the first time the 3 of us worked together, that stuff wouldn't be happening, so it's a huge benefit to sort of just having this more than, like nearly 2 decades of working together, Well,
I was only going to say, the looping dialogue aspect of it kind of played into the whole, obviously it's heavily influenced by the 60s, and we wanted to try and, it's interesting when you go back and look at sound design of those movies back in the 60s, before sound design was even a thing. They used different techniques for sound design, and we what we wanted to do was try and give it a kind of 60s flavor to it, and that's getting much more organic with the sound design than one would normally do. Rather than just there's a whole array of amazing plugins and stuff that can totally mangle sounds, but they're all kind of modern sounds. So we kind of, through process of experimentation, realized that actually the spookiness comes from organic sounds that are treated sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly. And that was a big thing from Edgar. It's like, trying to take everyday sounds and putting a bit of a weird spin on them, so that sometimes did I hear that right? Was that sounding a bit, even if you don't appreciate because they're working quite subtly, that you're messing with everyday sounds. And then, of course, as the story progresses, we kind of twist that knife in a bit more, and it becomes a bit more obvious, and those sounds get treated a bit more. But that spinning, the repeating dialogue and filtering dialogue, having fun with filtering dialogue, and it just becomes like a really weird, creepy, its simplicity makes it really creepy, as opposed to just throwing, which I am very tempted to do as a sound designer, load it up with whooshes and bangs and kind of funky sounds. But actually, quite often in the dub, Edgar was being quite restrained and saying to us, look, you don't need to have as much stuff here. Let's set the vibe with realistic organic sounds that are slightly treated, as opposed to going overboard in places. So yeah, it definitely made for a more organic kind of 60s vibe for the soundtrack.
I want to follow up on that. And you talked about influence, and Edgar, you said previously that, you want to sort of put all your cards on the table and tell your collaborators what was sort of influencing the approach. Were there specific films, or you mentioned Revolution Number 9, specific songs that you pointed Stephen and Julian to in terms of 60s sort of movies that kind of set the tone and the vibe that you were looking for in the film?
I'm trying to think if there's something that, in terms of the sound work, I'm not quite sure about that, because it's more like, I guess what we're doing is creating, the dissonance between the modern day and the past. I mean, I mean, in terms of the movies, it would be like a combination of like the sort of psychological thrillers and horror films that I liked of like the 60s and 70s, whether that be, Roman Polanski or Michael Powell or Alfred Hitchcock or Dario Argento, Mario Bava. But then in a way, like the sort of the bigger influence, in a way, in terms of actually the story, is of the kind of the dramas of the time, and like the sort of social dramas, and even the sort of the B-movie exploitation films would be about young girl comes to London and, has the temerity to want to be a star. And so there is a lot of those kind of films, like both, more well-known ones like John Schlesinger's Darling, or like lesser known ones like Beat Girl from 1960, would sort of be a big influence on where the movie was going. And, and sometimes there's things that are interesting where, Steve and Julian could talk about this, where we had to take songs that are like mono songs, sometimes very like lo-fi. There's one song by the Graham Bond organization that's in the movie that's, I think, is like a live recording that's probably just recorded with one mic. And so to put those songs into like Dolby Atmos requires a lot of, like work by these wizards to like make it kind of sound kind of like sort of, surround sound stereo. Is kind of quite remarkable. I'm trying to think if it's a good question in terms of, it's interesting with the Revolution Number 9 thing, but also I remember when Steve did the first demo, there were these bits of found sound. What sounded to me like found sound mixed into the music. And particularly there was a sound of what sounded like a children's playground mixed in. And I was saying to Steve, I said, what is that? Like the kids like laughing. It's so creepy. What the hell is that? And then Steve, maybe Steve, you can explain where that came from.
Well, yeah, it comes back to this idea of trying to use instruments and techniques from the 60s. So I'd immediately gone for the mellotron because I love using mellotrons anyway, but I kind of ventured into some of the other tapes, because we've all got the flutes and the violins and all these things that, you know from all those records, but they also made all these sound effects tapes at the time for theatre use or whatever it would be. And I got one of these, and on one of the keys, the C sharp, there was this sort of weird marketplace, childlike kind of yelling kind of stuff. And I put that into a certain sort of echo and started looping it all around. And it was just the most chilling thing. And it felt kind of period. It felt like you were just listening in on a 60s scene, but it had been filtered through all of these sort of loops into the present day. And Edgar responded really strongly to that. And that kind of launched the whole idea of the tape loops generally, and trying to make our own versions of that and using bits of the dialogue that would basically be like echoes of the past. They're kind of like calling through to the present day where Ellie is. So those things were just great little experiments that someone would respond to.
This is going to sound too like specific, but it is something that haunts me to this day. But like in Soho itself, and it's not so much the case now, but when I first moved there, like there was one specific street which is now completely gentrified into upmarket bistros and clothes shops, but it was one of those like sort of red light area streets, and it was right by Goldcrest, which is obviously like a famous post-production house, Great Windmill Street. And when you would walk up and down Great Windmill Street, which I would do like working for the last 20 years, there are all these kind of like clip joints. A clip joint is basically like where they're fleecing tourists, like naive tourists, and charging them £250 for champagne. Not unlike the story that happens in the Kinks song Lola, for example. So, but those clubs still existed. And there used to be a woman that stood outside these clubs. There was always a woman standing outside saying the same thing day in, day out. And having worked in Soho for 27 years, it's imprinted on my brain, even though she's long, long gone. She used to stand outside saying, "Sexy bed show, sir. Sexy bed show. Sexy bed show, sir." Any man that would walk past you say, "Sexy bed show." Now, the thing that made it extra creepy was that next door, in between these clubs, and this is still exists, there's a children's primary school, which is in the middle of all of these clubs. And so sometimes around break time, the kids are playing in the yard and you can hear the sound of kids playing next door to these like adult nightclubs. And I just remember when I first moved to London, and this is, that's the school is still there. Everything else is gone. And in fact, everything else is gone and it's been made upmarket and gentrified, but the kids' school is there. But back then, when it was the sort of the dissonance of like the sex industry at a kids' school next to each other, that was something that, as when I was a young person in Soho, I was like, "Whoa, what? How?" And so when I heard that sound of the mellotron of the kids playing, I was like, "Oh my God, this is giving me Great Windmill Street flashbacks."
That is awesome. That's great. One of the things, Edgar, that I've always enjoyed about your films is that there's such a playfulness and there's such a great energy in the way you use cinematography, camera movement, sound design, music. And one of the things I felt immediately, watching last night in Soho is like the first part of the movie is remarkably restrained for the three of you. It's really, really, following Eloise as she's leaving home and coming to London for the first time and starting on this, exploration of this new city and her career. There's not a lot of camera movement. There's not a lot of flash going on in the sound design, and the music is pretty straightforward. But then as she goes into Sandy's world, then everything just opens right up. So was that part of the just the design concept for the film for you, Edgar, from the beginning? And how did you work with these guys to make that pop in that way?
Yeah, it's definitely the idea is that it wasn't something where we wanted, it was a slow burn. You want to kind of lull people into a false sense of security that maybe this is going to be a gentle movie. And in a way, like your Eloise's journey to London is that you're sort of slowly peeling away, you're undermining her confidence. Like at the start of the movie, she's sort of very confident about going to London and making it big in fashion, and then her confidence gets undermined and she essentially goes into retreat, first by moving out of the halls of residence to stay in a bedsit on her own, And then in her dreams, she's retreating again into the 60s. But there was definitely one of the sort of the things that we talked about very early on was the idea of holding back, so that when you go to the first 60s dreams, that's when, I think it was like Julian, it was your idea of kind of holding back so that the surrounds don't kick in until the first dream. So you might think that it would be a quieter movie, but then it's like it starts kind of 24 minutes in or whatever it is. But Julian, I think that was something that you came up with very early on.
Yeah, well, it was really just to make the moment you go into the world of Sandy in the 60s pop as much as possible. And you kind of think, well, it's like if you watch an action movie that starts off with the full action and all the visual effects, you've kind of got nowhere to go, really. You're just kind of repeating the same thing. So we thought about how do we do that? How do we make that moment pop as much as possible? So we essentially, the first 24 minutes of the movie are almost a 3-track mono. There is stereo imagery in there, but it's narrowed up. It's all down the front, and also being very reserved with the levels. So it's kind of just, and the audience hopefully won't. It's not like you're going to sit there and turn to your person you're watching saying, hello, what's going on? There's no surround information. But it settles you into this kind of, it's like watching a black and white movie. You get, within a few minutes, you get into it, you just accept it. And then, of course, the moment when Ellie walks down the alleyway and then she comes out, we just it just means that rather than going from here to here, we're going from almost from 0 all the way up to 100, and it just balloons out. So, yeah, we just wanted to make that moment pop as much as possible, for the audience as much as it would for Ellie.
It's an amazing transition, and I presume that's when you kind of opened up the Atmos track as well.
Yeah, we go from 3-track, left, center, right, quite narrow down the front with reserved decibels, to full on Atmos, everything surrounds, all enveloping, and that stays all the way through down into the club. And that's where the whole kind of sonic tapestry starts to get very rich. I would say that's from that moment onwards is where, and then we stay. It's not like that I experimented with going, between modern day 60s, but that was just too much. But the restraining for the first 23.5 minutes or 24 minutes, and then popping out, and then staying in that full Atmos environment, I think really helped it. Really helped that moment of realization of what was happening sonically.
That sequence is a good example, as well as how we would play with source music, in that track, the Cilla Black track that's playing, only exists in its master. The tapes are long gone, so it's a 60s mix, and we had that playing on the record. But as Ellie enters 1960s London, we went back in the studio, we worked out the arrangement, and we performed it all again with the strings and the brass and the drummer and the bass player, so that when we did go into the corridor into the 60s, Julian could bring up those tracks, and the music then would go from being a little record playing to suddenly being this live performance. And as you go into the Café de Paris, you're in the middle of this performance, and that sort of stuff was great fun to play with the players in the actual room when that record was originally done in Abbey Road Studio 1.
Oh, that's amazing. That must have been a lot of fun to go back and kind of dissect those original recordings and figure out how to reverse engineer them.
In the same studio as well, right?
Absolutely. The same room that those were done, the same amount of players. We worked out the arrangement. They didn't exist anymore, so we just did that by ear and kind of worked out what they were doing. And they're amazing. Those arrangements are amazing. And the players respond because they're not used to all playing in the same room nowadays, so they all get excited. And it felt like you were stepping into a record. It was the weirdest thing. And we used Abbey Road still has all that fantastic old valve gear. Same microphones probably were on those sessions. So yeah, it definitely a shivery day.
So Edgar, I'm aware that we've only got you for another couple of minutes, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. But just a couple questions for you before you jump off. And Julian and Stephen, I know you can stick around with me for another few minutes and talk about some specific sequences. But Edgar, I was just curious. We talked about that opening up, but Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, how were you able to utilize those technologies to sort of make this into a much more sort of engaging and disturbing experience for the audience?
I guess by its very nature, any film should be immersive, obviously. In this film, you're seeing everything through Eloise's perspective. So like a lot of my movies, like the main character is in every single scene. And in this one, really, you wanted to feel like you were going down the rabbit hole with Eloise, and you're experiencing the story as she sees it and hears it. So, just within the mix anyway, what we were talking about, opening it up, and then sort of obviously with Dolby Vision and Atmos, you can just take it a lot further. I mean, I really sort of love the kind of like the Dolby cinemas that are out there in the world, because that you're getting like not just the best experience, but there's a sort of level of quality control. So whenever I hear that there's a Dolby Cinema screening, I would like sort of direct people to that like screening of the movie, because I know it's going to sound incredible and look incredible. So that's been, like we've really and not just with this movie and Baby Driver, but also remastering Scott Pilgrim in Dolby Vision and Atmos was an amazing experience. So it's a process that we really enjoy and hopefully continue with.
So, Julian, Steve, we were talking a little bit about that first sequence at the Café de Paris, which is one of my favorite sequences in the entire film. You're playing so much with perspective, and obviously, the audience is getting used to this idea of Sandy and Eloise, and sometimes we see them in reflections from the others. But can you talk a little bit about what's going on in the track in that sequence, because it's an incredibly complex and immersive. And I just want to give you guys a chance to talk about how you put that sequence together.
Well, from a sound design perspective, we wanted to be quite subtle in what we were doing, so that you weren't entirely sure whether it was happening or not. So as people walk past, and it's all quite dreamlike as well. There's a deliberate thing to make that sequence very dreamlike and warm, as opposed to the other sequences as the story progresses. So, we had fun filtering things and giving things a really kind of weird dissonance to them, but in a dreamlike state. So after the Scylla sings her song, the applause is mixed in with reversed applause and filtered applause. The voices have this kind of backwards reverb effect on some of them, not all of them, which again is a very dreamlike thing, which as we go through the story, that effect in itself changes and becomes a much more kind of darker, severe thing. But it was really to set it up so that it's a sequence of magical warmness, but also you're not entirely sure. Did I just hear that? Was that something's not right, but I'm not sure why? So it was all kind of trying to be subtle in many places. And in fact, with the Scylla, as Steve says, Steve did this amazing kind of arrangement and score around the song. He also kind of used, various plugins to strip out the Scylla vocals. So there's a moment in that sequence where we cut to Scylla Black, and I've got not only the original song, I've got the vocals separate and Steve's score doing its thing, so we can then push with the perspective, push and pull her vocals, so that when we cut close to her, I've got that kind of I've got the full arsenal to make it feel as real as possible. And of course, these recordings, as I discovered on Baby Driver, a lot of these, and as Edgar alluded to, these recordings, that when you put them up dry on a mixing stage, they don't sound quite as lush as you would like them to. So there's a lot of work done with kind of getting out the nasty frequencies and trying to make a mono recording bloom out into full Atmos, which takes a bit of time. But they're such great pieces of music. They're such evocative pieces of music that it's great fun to work with them.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because I'm just fascinated by this idea of you're taking a lot of mono music sources and making them into Atmos tracks. And can you just talk a little bit more about the process? Stephen, you mentioned that in some cases you went back and actually recreated the recording sessions, but was there any sort of post-production magic and trickery that you used to kind of broaden those things out?
There's certainly a couple of spots where things were. There's a Graham Bond organization live track that chaps talked about earlier, and something like that. We can do our things with EQ. We can try and separate things out, but sometimes they're just lacking the frequencies that you need for a sequence like that, you need it to feel like you're in the room. And with that, I remember tracking a bass guitar part, and you could feed that into your mix in the room and just give it enough of that sort of low end that it just kind of, you were still really focused on the original track, but we were just giving it some frequency support around the edges, just so it would function as we needed it to in the film. Always respecting what was there, but just doing what we needed to do to bring it to life, really.
One of the sequences that I wanted to ask you about is the design of the vocals and the mix at the Rialto Club when Sandy does her a cappella audition and sings the song Downtown. It's haunting. It's so beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached that particular sequence and how you put that vocal performance together? And was that actually Anya Taylor-Joy who was singing?
It is Anya Taylor-Joy, and she not only sings that version of Downtown, but because she did that so beautifully, she's actually the voice throughout the entire score. So there's, wherever you hear a female voice in the entire score, it is Anya as Sandy, calling to us from the 60s, like a siren song thing. But Downtown was the first thing that we did with her. And I remember going to Elstree Studios where they were filming really early one morning to rehearse with her, because we didn't know, if this was going to work. And I went with a piano player, and we sat down to work out how we were going to do Downtown. And it was really clear within the first 10 seconds that Anya can sing great. And she's got a lot of personality in her voice. And all of a sudden we went from this idea of having a cover version of Downtown to this slowed down a cappella thing, which she just performed. And we recorded it at British Grove Studios one evening, and we just got a U67 up in front of her and did a number of versions, and one of them just sang, and what you hear in the film with a little bit of post-production in terms of a little bit of reverb, but really not much at all, is Anya. And there was talk of her doing it on set live, and I know they did that, but there were so many angles that needed to match that we used that pre-record for that, and you hear that in the film. And then when we passed that on through our process, the music process, through to Julian, it was a case of giving him, here's our mix, and we separated out the reverb that we'd used to give him the option. And I think watching the film at the London premiere last week, it was kind of interesting how Julian took that and went from a very intimate sound to starting to make this experience of it. I mean, Julian, you can talk about how you did all that.
Well, there's not much to say. I mean, that was it. It was such a pure thing. It was such a, many times on Edgar movies, you kind of think to yourself, I'm getting paid to do this. It's kind of amazing, because you're having so much fun doing what you're doing. And I remember that sequence when we all watched it back. It's like, my God, she's amazing. And it's just something so pure about it. And I did very little. It was just an idea of making it very kind of much more almost naked to start with, and then as she gets into it, you just kind of bloom it out a bit and add the reverb. I actually did very little. I'd like to take a lot of credit for it, but it's not the case. It was just one of those things that just worked. And sometimes to do very little is the best thing to do. So that's what I did.
Well, certainly when you got a performance that's that powerful, sometimes the best thing to do is just get out of the way, right, and let it do its work.
Yeah, totally. I mean, with something like that, everyone knows it. It's not like, when that went up on the stage for the first time, we're all sitting there and we watched it through. What happens is, the way I like to work, when you're doing a final mix, you run the first 5 minutes, or you'll run the whole reel, just with just all faders up, just to have a look and see what we've got ahead of us. And that was I remember that being a moment of everyone just like jaw on the floor, totally amazed at what she'd done. So, it's the only thing you can do is mess it up. So don't.
That must have been a great day. I love what you talked earlier about the slow burn, and you start the film in a very sort of straightforward, very simple approach fashion. But then one of the things I love about the last third of the film is as Eloise, as her her tenuous grip on reality starts to break down, and we start to be concerned about her mental state. The sound design and the music both really do a lot of, I would say, lifting to give the audience the subjective experience of what she's experiencing and what the world is like for her. So can you talk a little about, I'm thinking about the sequences with the faceless men and the kind of the breakdown that she has in the workshop before she goes to the library. Can you talk about the approach to the sound design and the music in those sequences and how you worked to sort of give the audience that experience of what was happening for her from an emotional standpoint?
Yeah, for me, as the film progressed and we go into that sort of darker world, it felt that everything needed to reflect this sense of her being overwhelmed. And so musically, certainly, the score gets a lot more orchestral. The scale gets bigger during that phase of the film. And a lot of the little seeds we've planted very early on, the film starts with a little piano figure, a 3-note piano figure. And as you get into the library, that's become a string ostinato, and all of these little echoes from the past are coming through with the rhythms, and gradually these things that might be a little tap in the first reel are now a drum kit doing the whole rhythm of the thing. And that just felt like if we could make the journey a smooth sort of one, that we felt things escalating as she kind of dissolved. And the sounds get messier as well. A lot of the processing of the orchestra becomes more extreme there. It's not a pure thing anymore. All of that's being put through tape boxes and distortions and guitar fuzz pedals, all that sort of thing. So the whole thing just felt like we could afford to make her experience feel more confused, and it builds this kind of momentum through all that rolling along. And certainly sound design wise, it felt like we were going back and forth a lot during those sort of sequences to make sure we were each kind of not pushing too far too early and getting that sort of rise of the film in the right kind of way.
Yeah, Edgar, as I said before, Edgar was spot on with his restraint. In fairness, we wanted to put much more early on with regards to sound design, and Edgar would be like, "No, this is a slow burn. Let's save that for later on. Let's not necessarily have that now." I mean, with the Shadow Men, they obviously start off in 1960 Soho, but they start coming into Ellie's world in modern day. So we would take sounds from the 60s and start bringing those into modern day. And in fact, the Shadow Men there was a lot of experimentation with regards to how to make those guys sound. And we tried a multitude of different effects and ideas, and then realized that the simplest was the best, which was just their vocals and, utilizing, filters on their dialogue and this kind of emotive thing of the creepiness of these guys and what they were ultimately preying on Sandy. So, it was an exercise in restraint at times, I would say. And Edgar, being the genius that he is, knew exactly when to crank it to number 3, when to crank it to 5, and when to put it to 10.
Just one last sequence I wanted to ask you about, and it's it's Sandy's first night in the dressing room at the Rialto, as she sort of starts to understand that this kind of this promise of her big debut is turning out to be something quite darker and more sinister. And I feel like the sound design and the music all kind of kick into a higher level in that sequence as well. Could you talk a little bit about the approach to that specific sequence?
I love that sequence. I love that sequence for so many different, because the movie just takes a complete 90-degree turn. And also, like you've got this very chirpy song, Puppet on a String, which is such a lovely pop ditty. Yet when you examine those lyrics and what it means for Sandy, and certainly within that sequence, it takes on a very dark tone. And then, of course, you've got the Rialto, this club where this kind of performance is happening, and everything's great, and everything's on the surface very sweet and nothing too untoward. And then when we go backstage, there's that lovely kind of tracking shot that Edgar does with all these different dressing rooms, where you see that actually this is a really messed up place, and there's a lot of people who have lost their way. And so, that was where we really wanted to kind of amp up the sound design with regards to, I think Steve alluded to this before, that 60s kind of acid trip feel where, you got Jack shouting down the corridor at her as she's trying to run away. That in turn is being spun into a kind of its own little soundtrack. And I think that again, that's due to Steve. Steve is working with that. So you've got, Steve's score that's working with these repeated echoes of dialogue. And then we kind of took that and worked around it so that it didn't become a bit of a mess. But that's very much like, it's just a crazy sequence. It's crazy for many different reasons, but I love it because it starts off being one thing and takes this dark turn very quickly.
So I think, like Julian's saying, some of the 60s techniques that we were using in a sequence like that, the vocal delays, they're deliberately they sound quite coarse. They're tape echo. They're not trying to be posh, digital, precise things. They're distorting, and they're kind of, the sound is melting away. And it felt like that was reflective of the experience. And some of the panning, certainly in the music tracks around there as well, you're being kind of over extreme with it in that 60s kind of a way. Things are suddenly appearing. A backwards guitar might appear behind you in the left surround or whatever, and it might fling around because you're literally playing with it like you used to. And I think that kind of helped things feel like they were bedding into this unique vision of the 60s that Edgar had kind of presented visually.
There was a lot of acid done on that dub stage. A lot of acid
on all the
done.
films, though. This is the sad thing. Yeah.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because, of course, one of the things that you notice right away when you go back and listen to a lot of early stereo recordings of the 60s was that they were very eager to play with that new tool. And they were quite aggressive in terms of panning and how they used stereo imaging. And that must have opened up some really fun possibilities for the two of you as you were building these tracks to kind of emulate the feel of the 60s.
God, I mean, I've always loved that. I grew up with the 60s records of my parents, and I would go from speaker to speaker, and you could have a completely different experience of some of those records, listening to one speaker or the other. So I've always loved using panning, and this was just a great excuse to do that. And, some of those Jimi Hendrix ridiculous pans of things going around, sequences like the Sandy Shore track where we're running through Carnaby Street in London. It's full of those kind of whipping things around, and just embracing the roughness of some of that stuff was fun to do. It was kind of nice to push things into distortion and embrace that. It felt like we were making something that felt very earthy to me, and that suited the way that Edgar had shot it. It always feels very alive, this film, to me.
Yeah, because there's not much visual effects and stuff. There's so much in-camera stuff. I go back to that term organic. A lot of it was in camera. It's not like, and certainly the same was with Baby Driver, where you get the first cut and there's lots of blue screen, green screen, temp effects. It's all there. And so I think we were all being very cognizant of that and wanted it to have an equally as organic flavor for its imperfections as well. As Steve said, there's happy accidents in there that you wouldn't necessarily strive to look for, but when they happen, they're great. They just work. It's like, I know the sound team spent many a night actually for research, but spent many a late night in Soho going out and recording weird and wonderful sounds. And there's stuff in the movie that you just wouldn't be able to think of. It's just happy accidents, sonic stuff that if I sat down at my library and thought, okay, let's try looking for stuff, you cannot find that stuff. It's weird and wonderful. And sometimes it's a couple laughing outside Ellie's room as the story is, she's just started off in there. It's a couple laughing outside, and then maybe later on it's a couple arguing or some weird stuff that's going on outside. And that's the happy accidents syndrome. Stuff that just kind of you find and you put it in and it works.
Great. Well, I love the movie. It's really fantastic, and the work that you both did is just spectacular in it. So I'm curious for it to get out into the world and for people to have the experience and to respond to it. It's really, the movie's quite a lot of fun. It's a wicked little film that you guys have made.
Glad to hear it.
Thanks, sir, and always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks again to our friends Edgar, Stephen, and Julian for joining us. It's always a pleasure to hear how that team works together. And thanks to our friends at Focus Features for helping put this episode together. You can catch Last Night in Soho in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos at a Dolby Cinema near you. As always, we will have links to tickets in the show notes. But before you go, I hope you're subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. We've got more big episodes coming up, including some interviews with a few legends of the craft that you will not want to miss. You can find links to our dedicated podcast feed in your show notes, or you can just search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, thanks again for joining us. This has been the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines, and our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks for joining us.